Hi there. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the city lights twinkled below us as Catherine and I stood on the balcony of our favorite restaurant, celebrating our 11th wedding anniversary. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I looked at her. She looked stunning in her navy blue dress, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth that had first drawn me to her all those years ago. The past 11 years had been a whirlwind of laughter, love, and occasional challenges, but I always felt that we had navigated them together with a deep understanding and connection. Tonight was meant to be a testament to that. We were in our little world, savoring the meal and reminiscing about the moments that had defined our journey together. As we clinked our glasses of champagne, I was struck by how perfect everything seemed. Catherine's laughter filled the space around us, a sound I cherished deeply. Our conversations were filled with familiar warmth and affection, a reflection of the strong bond we shared. We had managed to build a life together that I was genuinely proud of, a home, careers, and a relationship that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. As I looked around at the elegance of the restaurant, I felt that this night was a fitting tribute to everything we had accomplished and to the future we were still building together. I was confident in the strength of our marriage and in the love we had for each other. The world outside might have its uncertainties, but within the walls of our shared life, I felt secure. Tonight was a celebration of us, of the life we had created, and of the many more years we hoped to share. In the months following our anniversary, I began to notice subtle shifts in Catherine's behavior. It started with small things, like her coming home later than usual and mentioning the increased workload at the office. She often talked about a new project that had come up, one that seemed to demand an extraordinary amount of her time and energy. The project, as she described it, was crucial for the company's future, and she was entrusted with a significant role. Catherine had always been dedicated to her job, but this time it felt different. She was more preoccupied, her mind often elsewhere, even during our quiet evenings at home. When I asked about her day, she would go on at length about the intricacies of the project and the high expectations placed upon her. Central to these conversations was her new boss, Dan. He had recently joined the company and was a driving force behind this project. Catherine spoke of him with a mix of admiration and respect, noting his leadership skills and his ambitious vision for the company's future. Dan was a name that became more and more frequent in our household. Catherine mentioned his innovative ideas, his demanding standards, and the long hours he put in. There was a palpable sense of excitement in her voice whenever she talked about their brainstorming sessions or late-night meetings to iron out project details. I tried to be supportive, understanding the pressures of her work and the importance of this project for her career. However, a nagging feeling of unease began to creep in. As the weeks turned into months, Catherine's late nights at the office became routine. She would often come home looking exhausted, her eyes tired and her energy drained. When I questioned her about it, she assured me it was just the nature of the project. "It's temporary," she would say, "just until we get everything off the ground." She'd smile and tell me not to worry, promising that things would soon return to normal. Despite her reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Catherine's behavior had changed in ways that went beyond just being busy. She was more distant, less engaged in our conversations, and often seemed lost in thought. Our once vibrant and lively dinners were now quieter, with her often distracted by her phone or emails. One night, after another long day at work, Catherine came home later than usual. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked more worn out than ever. I gently pressed her for details about what was going on, but she brushed off my concerns, attributing her weariness to the relentless pace of the project. "Dan is pushing us all hard," she explained, "but it's for the good of the company. We're almost there." Her frequent mentions of Dan and their late-night work sessions began to gnaw at me. It wasn't just the long hours that bothered me, it was the way she spoke about him, with a certain admiration that felt different from how she spoke about her other colleagues. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, telling myself that it was just the stress of the project, but doubt had already started to take root in my mind. I started to pay more attention to the little things. Catherine was more secretive with her phone, often taking it with her to the bathroom or keeping it on silent. There were moments when I would catch her texting late at night, her face illuminated by the screen's glow, but she would quickly put it away when I entered the room. I wanted to trust her, to believe that this was all just part of the job, but the growing distance between us made it increasingly difficult. My suspicions deepened when I overheard her talking on the phone with Dan one evening. She was in the kitchen, her voice low and filled with an intimacy that felt out of place for a work conversation. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was enough to set my nerves on edge. When she hung up, she gave me a quick, almost guilty smile and said, "Just discussing some last-minute details for tomorrow." I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that Catherine was just under a lot of stress, and that there was nothing more to it. But the changes in her behavior, the secretive phone calls, and her growing distance from me were hard to ignore. The foundation of trust that had once been the bedrock of our relationship now felt shaky and uncertain. As much as I wanted to believe her, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. Catherine's behavior continued to change in ways that were hard to ignore. She had always been open with me about her work, but now she was becoming increasingly secretive. Her phone, which used to lie casually on the kitchen counter or coffee table, was now a constant companion, always within her reach. Whenever it buzzed or chimed, she would quickly grab it and retreat to another room, often closing the door behind her. At first, I tried to dismiss these actions as just another aspect of her work-related stress. Perhaps she was dealing with confidential information or sensitive project details. But as the days went by, her secrecy became more pronounced. There were times when she would take calls late at night, whispering into the phone in the darkness of our living room while I lay in bed, pretending to be asleep. When I would ask about the calls, she would provide vague explanations or brush off my concerns, saying it was just work. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and found Catherine in the study, the door slightly ajar. She was on a video call with Dan. The tone of their conversation was light, filled with laughter, and a familiarity that felt out of place for a professional relationship. She hadn't noticed me standing there, and I watched as she twirled a strand of hair around her finger, a gesture I knew she did when she was nervous or excited. My stomach tightened with unease. Later that night, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Catherine was more distant than ever, her mind elsewhere. She picked at her food, barely engaging in our usual banter. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension, and I felt like an outsider in my own home. The woman sitting across from me, whom I had loved and cherished for over a decade, now seemed like a stranger. The turning point came when I noticed she had changed the password on her phone. This was something she had never done before. It felt like a wall being erected between us, a barrier that kept me out of a part of her life that had once been open and shared. My suspicions grew stronger, and I found myself constantly on edge, looking for signs, trying to decipher the changes in her behavior. The final blow came on a Saturday afternoon. Catherine had gone out for what she said was a meeting with a client, leaving her phone charging on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with a new message, and I glanced at the screen out of habit. What I saw made my heart stop. It was a message from Dan. I hesitated for a moment, a mixture of guilt and desperation coursing through me, before picking up her phone. The messages were still open, and what I read confirmed my worst fears. Dan had sent a string of texts that were far from professional. They spoke of feelings and plans, of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. One message in particular stood out. "I can't wait to see you tonight. Thinking about you all day." My hands trembled as I scrolled through the conversation. Catherine's responses were equally damning, filled with affection and longing. They talked about the times they had shared, their excitement about future meetings, and how much they missed each other. It was clear that their relationship had crossed the boundaries of professionalism and had become something far more intimate. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? What did Dan have that I didn't? Was our entire marriage a lie? But amid the anger, there was also a deep sense of sorrow. The woman I loved, the one I'd built my life with, was sharing her heart with someone else. I knew I couldn't ignore this. Confronting Catherine was inevitable, but I wanted to approach it with a clear mind. The revelation of Catherine's messages with Dan left me in a state of turmoil. I couldn't let go of the thought that there might be more to uncover. My mind raced with scenarios, each one more painful than the last. I needed to know the extent of their relationship and how deeply it had affected our lives. It wasn't enough to confront Catherine with what I had found. I needed evidence, clarity, something concrete to understand the full picture. I decided to start by examining Catherine's schedule more closely. She'd always been meticulous about keeping her calendar organized, both digitally and on a physical planner she kept in her home office. One evening, when she was out for what she claimed was a work dinner, I took the opportunity to look through her planner. I found a pattern almost immediately. Certain days of the week were marked with nondescript entries like meeting or client lunch, often at times when I knew she would usually be available for us to have dinner together. The entries were vague, providing no real detail about where she was going or with whom. It was unlike Catherine to be so imprecise, which only fueled my suspicions. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to follow her the next time she had one of these ambiguous meetings. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. She mentioned a lunch meeting with a potential client and left the house around noon. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I knew I had to be careful, so I kept a safe distance as I followed her car through the city. My heart pounded as I tailed her, each turn heightening my anxiety. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a small upscale restaurant we had frequented in happier times. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she walked inside, her demeanor casual yet purposeful. My stomach churned as I wondered if Dan would be there. I waited for a few minutes, then decided to enter the restaurant. The hostess greeted me, and I quickly scanned the room. There, in a corner booth, sat Catherine and Dan. They were deep in conversation, their faces close together, sharing an intimacy that was impossible to miss. It felt like a punch to the gut, seeing them so comfortable, so at ease with each other. I requested a table where I could observe them without being seen. From my vantage point, I watched as they laughed, shared a bottle of wine, and leaned in close to talk. The way they interacted was undeniably intimate, far beyond the realm of a professional relationship. My mind raced with anger and betrayal, but I forced myself to stay calm, to gather more information. Throughout their meal, they seemed completely absorbed in each other. At one point, Dan reached across the table and took Catherine's hand, his thumb gently stroking her fingers. She smiled at him in a way that made my heart ache, a smile I had once believed was meant only for me. They lingered over dessert, their conversation punctuated by soft laughter and shared glances. It was clear that this was not a one-time occurrence. Their comfort level suggested a routine, something they had done many times before. The realization that this had been happening under my nose was almost too much to bear. When they finally stood to leave, I slipped out ahead of them, not wanting to risk being seen. I sat in my car, my mind reeling, as I watched them exit the restaurant together. They stood by her car for a few moments, talking quietly. Then, to my horror, Dan leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a brief, casual kiss. It was deep and passionate, filled with an emotion that left no room for doubt. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal. Seeing them together like this was devastating, but it also provided the confirmation I needed. This was no innocent work relationship. It was an affair, plain and simple. As I drove home, my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. The evidence was undeniable. Catherine had been lying to me, deceiving me, and destroying the trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to confront her with what I had seen, to force her to acknowledge the truth. When Catherine returned home that evening, she seemed more relaxed than she had in weeks, but I couldn't bear to look at her the same way. My love for her was now tangled with anger and hurt. I knew the conversation we needed to have would be the hardest of my life, but it was unavoidable. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it would be. In the days following my discovery of Catherine's affair with Dan, I found myself spiraling into a dark place of doubt and confusion. I felt isolated, as if the weight of my suspicions and the evidence I had gathered were too much to bear alone. It was during this turbulent time that I decided to reach out to my old friend Rick, someone I trusted implicitly. Rick and I had known each other for years. We had met in college and had stayed close ever since. He worked in the same industry as Catherine, which gave him a unique perspective on the dynamics at play in her workplace. I hoped that talking to him might offer some clarity, or at the very least, some much-needed support. We arranged to meet at our favorite bar, a cozy place where we had shared many laughs and stories over the years. As we sat down with our drinks, I tried to keep the conversation light at first, but the turmoil inside me made it difficult. Rick, always perceptive, noticed my unease. "Jason, you seem off tonight. What's going on? He asked, his brow furrowing with concern. I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. Rick, I'm dealing with something serious. It's about Catherine. I think she's having an affair. Rick's eyes widened in surprise, and he leaned in closer. What makes you say that? Do you have any proof? I recounted everything, her secretive behavior, the messages I found, the lunch meeting with Dan, and the kiss I had witnessed. Rick listened intently, nodding occasionally, but remaining silent until I finished. Wow, Jason, that's a lot to process, he said, his voice filled with empathy. I don't know what to say. I've seen relationships fall apart before, but this hits close to home. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. I just don't know what to do, Rick. It feels like my world is falling apart. And the worst part is, I don't know if I can ever trust her again. Rick sat back, his expression thoughtful. You know, it's strange you mention this. I heard some rumors at a recent industry event. A few people were talking about Catherine and Dan, speculating about their relationship. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but hearing your side of the story now, it all makes sense. My heart sank. The rumors Rick had heard were like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. If others were talking about it, then it wasn't just my imagination or paranoia. This was real, and it was public enough to be noticed by people outside our immediate circle. Do you know what they were saying exactly? I asked, my voice tinged with desperation. Rick sighed. It was mostly whispers and gossip, but the consensus was that their relationship seemed unusually close. People noticed they spent a lot of time together, even outside of work hours. There was talk about them being seen at restaurants, leaving work late together, things like that. Hearing this from Rick, someone I trusted, made the situation feel even more dire. It wasn't just my perception. Others had noticed the same things I had. The affair was more than just a betrayal. It was a public spectacle, a humiliation that I had been blind to for too long. Rick placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Jason, I'm sorry you're going through this. You don't deserve it. If you need anything, support, advice, someone to talk to, I'm here for you. I nodded, deeply appreciative of his friendship. Thanks, Rick. It means a lot. I'm not sure what my next step is, but knowing I have you in my corner helps. As we finished our drinks, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Talking to Rick had given me the validation I needed, but had also confirmed my worst fears. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful decisions. But for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. With Rick's support, I knew I could face whatever came next. The weight of what Rick had told me hung heavily on my shoulders. Armed with the confirmation of my worst fears, I knew it was time to confront Catherine directly. The thought of this conversation filled me with dread, but I couldn't live in uncertainty any longer. I needed to hear the truth from her, even if it shattered everything we had built together. That evening, as Catherine came home from work, I was waiting for her in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable as she walked in, her usual smile faltering when she saw the seriousness on my face. Jason, is everything all right? She asked, her voice laced with concern. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Catherine, we need to talk, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She hesitated, then nodded, taking a seat across from me. Of course. What's on your mind? I know about you and Dan, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I've seen the messages. I've followed you to your meetings. I know this isn't just about work. Her face went pale, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. Then she quickly composed herself. Jason, I don't know what you think you saw, but I promise you it's not what it looks like. Dan and I are just colleagues. Yes, we've spent a lot of time together because of the project, but that's all it is. I felt a surge of anger and frustration. Don't lie to me, Catherine. I saw you two at the restaurant, and I saw him kiss you. This isn't just professional. You've been hiding things from me, changing passwords, taking secret calls. I deserve the truth. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Jason, I never meant for it to go this far. Dan and I got close because of the project, and it just happened. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. Her admission was like a knife to the heart. The woman I had loved and trusted had betrayed me, and hearing her say it out loud made it all too real. Why, Catherine, why did you do this? Wasn't our life together enough? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I felt drawn to him and things got out of hand. But it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're my husband, and I still love you. I stared at her, struggling to process her words. Love? How can you say that when you've been sneaking around behind my back? You've broken my trust, Catherine. How can we ever come back from this? She reached out to me, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. Jason, please. I want to make this right. I'll end it with Dan. I'll do whatever it takes. But the damage had been done. I stood up, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. I need some time to think. I can't just pretend everything is okay after this. I need to figure out what's next. Catherine nodded, her expression one of deep regret. I understand. I'm so sorry, Jason. I never wanted to hurt you. I left the room, leaving her sitting there in tears. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but one thing was clear. Our relationship had been irrevocably changed. After the confrontation with Catherine, I knew there was one more person I needed to speak to, Dan. I needed to hear his side of the story, to understand how this had happened and what his intentions were. I couldn't move forward without confronting the man who had played a part in tearing my life apart. I arranged to meet Dan at a neutral location, a small coffee shop away from the office. He arrived punctually, his demeanor calm and composed. As he approached the table, I could see a hint of apprehension in his eyes. He knew why I had called him here. Dan, thanks for meeting me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course, Jason, he replied, sitting down across from me. I assume this is about Catherine. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I know about the affair. Catherine admitted it. I need to hear it from you. What happened between you two? Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not going to lie to you, Jason. Yes, Catherine and I have been involved. It started as just work, but we got closer over time. She's an incredible woman, and we connected on many levels, but I never intended to hurt you or your marriage. I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to keep my composure. How long has this been going on? A few months, Dan admitted. It wasn't planned. We didn't set out to have an affair. It just happened. And before we knew it, we were in too deep. His words did little to soothe the anger and betrayal I felt. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined my marriage, Dan. Catherine and I have been together for 11 years. How could you do this? Dan looked genuinely remorseful. I'm sorry, Jason. I truly am. I care about Catherine, but I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted to cause this pain. I leaned forward, my voice low and intense. If you care about her, you'll end this. Whatever this is between you two, it stops now. She says she wants to make things right, and I need to know if you're willing to step back. Dan nodded slowly. I understand. If that's what Catherine wants, I'll respect it. I'll step back. I don't want to cause any more harm than I already have. There was a long silence as we both processed the gravity of the situation. Finally, I stood up, feeling a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I hope you mean that, Dan. Because if you don't, I will do everything in my power to protect what's left of my marriage. Dan stood as well, his expression serious. I do mean it, Jason. I'm truly sorry for the pain I've caused. I'll respect Catherine's decision and give you both the space you need. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a small sense of closure. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and emotional healing, but at least I had taken the first steps. Whether or not my marriage could be saved remained to be seen, but I knew I had to try, for both Catherine's sake and my own. I returned home with a heavy heart, my mind racing with the conversation I had with Dan. As soon as I walked through the door, I saw Catherine waiting for me, her eyes filled with anxiety and regret. I could no longer contain my anger and frustration. Catherine, I need answers now, I demanded, my voice trembling with emotion. Why did you do this to us? She looked down, tears forming in her eyes. Jason, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But the truth is, I've been unhappy for a long time. Her words cut deep. Unhappy? Why didn't you say anything? We could have worked on it together. Catherine wiped her tears and took a deep breath. I tried to ignore it, to make it work for the sake of our history. But as time went on, I felt more and more disconnected from you. When Dan came along, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive, appreciated. I'm not excusing what I did, but that's the truth. The weight of her confession hit me hard. Our marriage had been crumbling, and I hadn't even noticed. The betrayal felt even more profound now. Our conversation turned into a long, emotional confrontation. We both aired our grievances, our frustrations, and our disappointments. Catherine admitted that she couldn't continue living in a marriage where she felt so unhappy and unfulfilled. She confessed that her feelings for Dan had only highlighted the cracks in our relationship. I felt a mix of sorrow and anger. "So what now, Catherine? What happens to us?" She looked at me, her expression resigned. "I think it's best if we part ways, Jason. I can't keep pretending everything is fine, and it's not fair to either of us." The reality of her words settled over me like a cold, heavy fog. As much as I wanted to fight for our marriage, I realized that sometimes love isn't enough. Our future together had become impossible. With a heavy heart, I nodded. "If that's what you want, then I guess it's the only option. We'll figure out the details, but for now, I think we both need some space." As I left the room, I felt a sense of finality. Our 11-year marriage was over, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. We could no longer walk it together. In the aftermath of Catherine's confession and our painful separation, I found myself engulfed in a maelstrom of emotions. The betrayal and the end of our 11-year marriage left me reeling, struggling to make sense of my new reality. The house we had shared felt empty and haunted by memories of happier times. Each room echoed with laughter and love that now seemed like a distant, cruel illusion. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Nights were spent tossing and turning, my mind replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I had missed, red flags I had ignored. The pain was relentless, seeping into every aspect of my life. I found it difficult to focus at work, my productivity plummeting as my thoughts constantly drifted back to Catherine and Dan. Friends and family offered their support, but their well-meaning advice and comforting words often felt hollow. They couldn't fully grasp the depth of my despair, the sense of betrayal that gnawed at my soul. I felt isolated and trapped in a cycle of anger, sadness, and confusion. One evening, after a particularly rough day, I found myself staring at a pamphlet I had picked up at a doctor's appointment months ago. It was for a local therapist specializing in marital issues and emotional trauma. Despite my initial hesitation, I realized I couldn't navigate this storm alone. I needed professional help to process my emotions and find a way to move forward. The first session with Dr. Morgan was both daunting and cathartic. Sitting in her cozy, softly lit office, I felt a mixture of apprehension and hope. Dr. Morgan, a kind woman in her late 40s with a calming presence, greeted me warmly and encouraged me to share my story at my own pace. As I recounted the events that had led to my current state, the tears I had held back for so long finally flowed freely. "Jason, what you're experiencing is completely normal," Dr. Morgan said gently. "Betrayal by someone you love deeply is one of the most painful experiences a person can endure. It's important to acknowledge your feelings and permit yourself to grieve." We delved into the complexities of my emotions, exploring the anger, sadness, and profound sense of loss I felt. Dr. Morgan helped me understand that healing would be a gradual process and that it was okay to take my time. She introduced me to various coping mechanisms, such as mindfulness exercises and journaling, to help me manage the overwhelming waves of emotion. "One step at a time, Jason," she reminded me during each session. "Be patient with yourself. Healing isn't linear, and it's okay to have setbacks." As weeks turned into months, therapy became a lifeline. Dr. Morgan guided me through the darkest parts of my pain, helping me confront and understand my feelings of inadequacy and betrayal. She encouraged me to focus on self-care, to rebuild my life and sense of identity outside of my marriage. I started to reclaim parts of myself that I had neglected during my marriage. I took up running again, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement and the fresh air filling my lungs. I reconnected with old friends and found comfort in their company, allowing myself to lean on them during moments of vulnerability. Dr. Morgan also helped me navigate the difficult conversations with Catherine as we finalized our separation. Through therapy, I learned to communicate my needs and boundaries clearly, ensuring that I protected my mental and emotional well-being during this tumultuous time. One of the most profound moments in therapy came when Dr. Morgan asked me to write a letter to Catherine, not to send, but as a way to express my feelings and gain closure. Pouring my heart onto the paper, I wrote about my pain, my love, and my hopes for the future. It was a cathartic experience, allowing me to release some of the anger and sadness that had been weighing me down. Gradually, I began to feel a sense of acceptance. The wounds were still there, but they were healing, and I was learning to live with the scars. Therapy taught me that it was okay to let go, to forgive, not just Catherine, but also myself. I had done the best I could with the information and circumstances I had. By the end of my therapy journey, I had started to envision a future where I could find happiness again. The pain of betrayal and the dissolution of my marriage would always be a part of my story, but they didn't have to define me. With Dr. Morgan's guidance, I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece, and discovering my strength and resilience. Looking back, I realized that seeking help was the most courageous step I had taken. It allowed me to confront my pain, understand my emotions, and ultimately begin the process of healing. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer alone. I had found the tools and support I needed to move forward, one day at a time. Deciding to file for divorce was one of the hardest choices I ever had to make. Although my heart ached and my mind was still reeling from the betrayal, I knew that there was no turning back. Our 11-year marriage was over, and it was time to confront the practicalities and formalities of ending it. I reached out to a divorce attorney, Miss Turner, who came highly recommended by a friend. Our first meeting was overwhelming. The sterile office environment, filled with stacks of legal documents, and the somber tone of our discussion made the reality of my situation hit home. "Jason, the first step is to file a divorce petition," Miss Turner explained. "Well, outline the grounds for divorce, which in this case can be based on infidelity." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. "What about dividing our assets?" Miss Turner leaned forward, her expression serious. "Asset division can be one of the most contentious parts of a divorce. We'll need to create a comprehensive inventory of all your joint assets, property, savings, investments, and then negotiate a fair division." I sighed, knowing that this process would be anything but simple. Catherine and I had accumulated a lot together over the years, and the thought of dividing it all up was daunting. The following weeks were consumed with meetings, paperwork, and countless discussions with Catherine. Each conversation felt like a tug of war, trying to balance fairness with the emotional toll. We had to determine who would keep the house, how to divide our savings, and what to do with shared belongings. "Jason, we need to handle this with some level of civility," Catherine said one day as we reviewed the division of our possessions. "We should focus on what's fair." "I agree," I replied, though my voice carried a trace of frustration. "We need to be practical about this. It's not just about what we want, but what's reasonable." One of the most challenging parts was the division of sentimental items. Family photos, keepsakes, and heirlooms all held significant emotional value. Deciding who would keep what felt like a direct assault on the memories of our shared life. "We should try to be fair here," I said, attempting to maintain a calm demeanor. "We both have memories attached to these things." Catherine looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "I agree. Let's make copies of the photos and we can each take a portion of the heirlooms." It was a small concession, but it helped preserve a sense of mutual respect. Despite everything, we both acknowledged the importance of the history we had shared and tried to handle it with dignity. The final stage was the mediation session, where we signed the divorce papers. It was a moment marked by a mix of relief and sadness. The legal process was coming to an end, but the emotional journey was far from over. As I left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and a strange sense of freedom. The legal battle had been intense, but it was a necessary step toward moving on. The paperwork was completed and the formalities were done. Now, it was time to focus on healing and rebuilding my life. Looking back, I was grateful for the professional guidance that helped me navigate this difficult process. Miss Turner's expertise provided clarity and structure during a chaotic time. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I felt a renewed sense of strength and determination to face whatever came next. Months had passed since the finalization of the divorce. My life was slowly taking on a new shape, and the wounds from the past were beginning to heal. I had focused on rebuilding myself, reconnecting with old friends, pursuing new interests, and rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage. The pain of betrayal had become a part of my past, and I was ready to look toward the future. One crisp autumn morning, I decided to take a walk through a local park that had always been a favorite spot of mine. The park was alive with the colors of fall, and the vibrant hues of the leaves were a stark contrast to the somberness of the past months. As I strolled along the path, I felt a sense of peace and clarity that had been elusive for so long. I reached a small, serene pond and sat on a bench, reflecting on the journey I had undergone. The betrayal, the legal battles, and the emotional turmoil had been overwhelming, but they had also led me to a place of growth and self-discovery. I was no longer defined by the pain of my past, but rather by the strength and resilience I had developed. As I was lost in thought, a familiar face approached me, one I hadn't seen in years. It was Laura, a former colleague and friend. We had lost touch over the years, but seeing her brought a smile to my face. "Jason, is that you?" she asked, her eyes widening in surprise. "Laura," I said, standing up to greet her. "It's been a long time. What a pleasant surprise." We exchanged pleasantries, and Laura mentioned she had recently moved back to town and was now working nearby. Our conversation flowed easily, and we spent hours catching up. It felt refreshing to talk to someone who knew me before all the upheaval, someone who remembered a time when life was simpler and filled with potential. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Laura turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You seem different, Jason. There's a calmness about you that wasn't there before." I nodded, a sense of accomplishment and acceptance washing over me. "It's been a journey, but I'm starting to find my way again. The past months have been difficult, but they've taught me a lot about myself." Laura smiled and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes the hardest times in life lead us to new beginnings we never expected." Her words resonated deeply with me. The end of my marriage had been a devastating blow, but it had also opened doors to new opportunities and experiences. It forced me to confront my deepest fears and insecurities and emerge stronger on the other side. As we said our goodbyes and promised to stay in touch, I walked away from the park with a renewed sense of hope. The pain of the past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined my future. I had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life and to find joy in the small, everyday moments. At that moment, I realized that while the end of one chapter can be painful, it also creates the space for new stories to unfold. I was ready to face whatever came next with an open heart and a resilient spirit. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had led me to a place where I could finally begin to envision a new beginning, a future filled with possibilities and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And as I looked ahead, I felt a sense of peace knowing that, despite everything, I had survived the storm and was ready to embrace the new dawn that lay before me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.